control war directly. That person became known as Empress Suiko, and she had her base in a place called Asuka, so that period is known as the Asuka period. This is a modern reconstruction of the seat of political power in Asuka times, and it's very famous for Buddhist art, importing Buddhism and Buddhist art. Now, the reason this is an important period to talk about is under Empress Suiko, there was a regent who helped her rule at the time, named Prince Shotoku, who undertook a systematic attempt to unify the Japanese island under the rule of one ruler. And so before that, it was all sorts of competing kingdoms. The Yamato clan claimed to be the superior kingdom, but they didn't have direct rule over everyone else. Under Empress Suiko and Prince Shotoku, there was an attempt to do away with this sort of double system of lesser rulers and higher ruler and have just one ruler at the center. And part of that was claiming that legitimacy of being an imperial ruler was then to compare themselves to Chinese imperial rule as well. And this is the case where the Japanese sort of trajectory of political development diverges quite radically from the Korean case, where the Korean case used Chinese imperial recognition as a way of bolstering their own legitimacy and power. The Japanese, beginning with Prince Shotoku, saw their imperial power as being in competition, whether direct opposition to, or to some extent being superior to the Chinese case. And there's a very famous letter that you'll hear about quite often, so I should tell you about it here as well, addressed from Suiko's court, Empress Suiko's court, to the Sui emperors on the throne at the time. And the letter said, "From the sovereign of the land of the rising sun, and the sovereign of the land of the setting sun," because Japan was in the east and China was in the west. The Sui emperor was not amused at being addressed this way, but the term, the land of the rising sun, gave rise to this Japanese term, Nihon, which literally means the root of the sun, which then came to be an alternative title for Japan, which was more inclusive than Yamato. Right? Yamato was this one central plain region. Nihon was now a conceptual label to try and sort of conceive of the entire island of Japan as, I wouldn't say nation at this point, but as a kingdom or state, I suppose. And once again, part of claiming that sort of status, imperial status, was using culture. Many refugees that were left the wars that were happening in Korea, from Texan and Korea in particular, fleeing attacks from Sheila, ended up in Japan and brought a lot of culture from the mainland with them. Oh, by the way, the modern English name Japan comes from Nihon in an interesting way. This Urban is pronounced Urban in Chinese, not Nihon. And then when it's spelled in an old way of spelling, which I didn't put up there, an old way Giles romanization system, it's spelled J-I-H-P-E-N, which then was turned into Japan eventually. So you can trace back these English names quite far, actually, to the 7th century in both the Korean and Japanese case. You can trace back China all the way back to the Qin dynasty in the Chinese case. So the major tool, I guess, cultural tool that was used by Shotoku to declare this idea of imperial rule on the Japanese island was the promulgation of what's called a 17-article constitution. You don't have to write down all these 17 articles. I just put them up there because it seems silly not to put all 17 for you. This is known as the 17-article constitution. But I've highlighted a few in blue to show you sort of how a nascent empire goes about establishing its legitimacy. You'll see the Buddhism figures in this as well. The first one, harmony, should be valued. This idea of harmony against the constant warfare, which was the case in Japan at the time. Some people point to that as coming from a Confucian sort of context. So there's a Confucian strain as well as a Buddhist strain within the 17-article constitution. But then there are explicit elements about revering Buddhism. Making proper behavior, the first principle, is the Confucian principle as well. punishing evil and rewarding the good, these argues in sort of legalist context, of course, that's a kind of universal impulse. There's one here, where to go? Decision in important matters should not, do not fail to obey the commands of your sovereign. Right? Elsewhere, I don't think it's in this document, but elsewhere, Prince Toku uttered that the people cannot have two masters. So what he was trying to do away with is this old system where all the Uji clans had their own sort of rulers and their own sort of local cultures and political units, and now have everyone, theoretically at least, be loyal to one sovereign, the emperor or empress in this case. And that included taxation, which now, here it is, there cannot be two lords in a country. That's tied directly to the issue of taxation, right? So that the local lords are not allowed to levy taxes anymore. All taxes have to go to the central government. So this is a key document in terms of the birth of Japan as a kind of unified political entity. And this was built upon in an era known as the Taika era, the Great Reform era, in which there was a faction that moved against the Soga clan and reasserted the power of the emperor. And this is a constant tension throughout Japanese history as well. I said that the emperors often don't have much power, but sometimes they're given more power by other clans who want to take power away from the powerful clans behind the throne, so they use the pretense of helping the emperor reassert his or her own power as a way of getting rid of the rival clan. Then once they get the emperor reasserted as a source of political power, then the clan that helped the emperor do that then moves into the position of being the powerful on the throne. And this is exactly what happened here in 645. By the way, this faction, this family that moves against the Soga clan, after the Taika emperor took the throne, they were given a new surname, which is Fujiwara. The Fujiwara clan becomes very important in later Japanese history as well. So some of these reforms that were put into place to now build upon this theoretical, the 17-point constitution is a sort of theoretical blueprint for building an empire. The Taika reforms actually try to put some of that into physical effect. They instituted a new land distribution system borrowed from Tang China, sort of equal field distribution system to try and get land and power out of the hands of just a few families and distribute it more evenly. But perhaps the most salient or noticeable move was to build an entire city, the city of Nara, which is still in existence today. There's a map of it here. You can see it's laid out on this grid system, very much like Tang Dynasty Chan'an. It was copied after Tang Dynasty Chan'an, and with the same sort of wards and everything, and even oriented in the similar fashion by compass points. This happened in 710, and the entire court moved there to Nara. This is still in the Yamato Plain, but a different part of it. The two major distinctions or differences from the Chinese case of Chang'an is this is not a walled city, which indicates that there was no perceived threat from the outside, so they didn't build a wall around it. And as well, most of the city remained empty. So while Chang'an was a sort of thriving metropolis with people from all over the world, it was like full to the brim. Millions of people. Nara is basically fields with empty roads with the palace in the middle of it. It was more an idea of an imperial city rather than an actual sort of thriving metropolis unto itself. Much actually culture from during this period there was active sort of traveling back and forth between Japan, sending envoys from Japan to China, as well as sending envoys traveling to Japan. Buddhist monks were, as well as merchants, were also very active sort of conduits for cultural interchange. And there was a lot of Sui dynasty, Tang dynasty, even earlier Six dynasties culture, which is preserved in Japan in terms of architecture, in terms of dress. That was lost in China itself as dynasties rose and fell over time. It's kind of got imported and then preserved in the Japanese context. So there's a lot of scholarship on Tang dynasty culture that takes place in Japan that's of interest to Chinese scholars as well. Our civilization, though, was completely dependent on the Chinese language for writing. Japanese hadn't developed their own writing system yet at this point, although they did something similar to the Koreans. They started using Chinese characters as a way of writing down Japanese sounds, but it wasn't until a later period that an entirely different Japanese script was developed. But we can say with the Taika reforms, we now have a unified Japanese empire that is not part of the Chinese imperial order. So this is the key distinction to make, where in the Korean case, there were these kingdoms that did not call themselves empires that often had some sort of relationship with the Chinese empire, depending on how how the Koreans wanted to adapt that relationship to build their own power in the Korean kingdom. In the Japanese case, it was building an independent empire that was on the model of the Chinese empire, but not part of the Chinese empire. So it's kind of a different relationship. In both cases, the Korean case and the Japanese case, these peoples are actively adapting Chinese culture for their own purposes, right? So it's not a matter of just influence Chinese culture just pouring in and people are just imitating it. It's using Chinese culture in different ways. So in this case, it's forming a sense of Japanese empire that's distinct from the Chinese empire, not part of it, but on Chinese models. Once again, Buddhism becomes a part of that. The way Queen Sondo used Buddhism to establish her own legitimacy in the Shilla. There was an emperor named Shogun in this period, the Taika period, at Nara, who sponsored the building of a massive temple complex called Todaiji. Here's a modern picture of the main temple, which was just huge. It became a national, not only national, but international center for Buddhist study. And so what it was an attempt to create a center for Buddhism that was independent in China, that now Japanese Buddhist monks and scholars could not have to travel to China, they could go to Todaiji to carry out their studies, and then attracted scholars from all over the world. And in fact, there was a huge bronze Buddha that was 53 feet tall that was built for the Todaiji temple. And it became a kind of symbolic declaration of the independence of Japanese Buddhism and Japanese culture from the Chinese mainland. And a monk traveled all the way from India to Japan at the time, which was no mean feat to do at this period, and did the opening of the eye ceremony of dedicating the statue at Todaiji. There were about 10,000 priests that came to Todaiji to study, not all at once, but over a given period. And it was a way of extending the sort of physical reach and symbolic representation of imperial power across the whole Japanese island. There was a decree by the emperor that branch temples would be built in every province of Japan that would be affiliated with the Todaiji temple in Nara. So it became a very real way of projecting imperial power over the entire empire. This was also the time when the first great anthology of Japanese poetry was compiled using Chinese characters. It's called the Narnyoshu, or the Collection of 10,000 Leaves. And in it we have the earliest examples of native Japanese poetry called waka and haiku poetry. And it's written in all sorts of voices as well, kind of like the poetry classic. Men and women, farmers, soldiers, and aristocrats too, all find voice in these poems. There's a very famous early poet who wrote a poem which became quite famous, so we skip to that from Narnyoshu. Sorry, I didn't put his name up there. It's Kakenomoto no Hitomaru. I believe this actually comes from your textbook, so you can see it there. Since in Karu lived my wife, I wished to be with her to my heart's content, but I could not visit her constantly because of so many watching eyes. Men would know of our troth had I sought her too often, so our love remained secret like a rock-pent pool. I cherished her in my heart, looking to after-time when we should be together, and this secure in my trust as one riding a great ship. Suddenly there came a messenger who told me she was dead, gone like a yellow leaf of autumn, dead as the day dies with the setting sun, lost as the bright moon is lost behind the cloud. Alas, she is no more, whose soul was bent to me like the bending seaweed. I've got a soft spot for poetry, so throw it in there now and then. That was a good one, I think. Now back to the sort of nitty-gritty of history. Sources, in terms of where we find these sources for early Japanese history. Once again, the Chinese dynastic histories, those are the green page, are earliest written sources. And then we have later works that were written in Chinese. You can see them here. They're written in Chinese characters, and then they were annotated using Japanese phonetics to try and show people how to pronounce those Chinese characters. And then later the Japanese phonetics were used to write Japanese themselves, so this is a later annotation of it. After Chinese dynastic histories, the Japanese themselves wrote histories using Chinese characters. And by the way, these again were sort of state-building projects, right? So one way of establishing cultural legitimacy for a ruling house is to compile the history leading up to it. Of course, in which they are the natural result, the end result of history is the ruling house who sponsors that history, so it makes them sort of elevates them in the eyes of culture. And there are two of these, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are the two important ones to know about. And finally, the Manmoshu collection of 10,000 leaves from the 7th century is the earliest collection of Japanese poetry. Both of these histories, and I believe I gave you some passages from them in your readings, follow the Chinese model of history in terms of this sort of Confucian ideal of history being used as a mirror in which to examine your own conduct. So history becomes sort of a moral exercise, not just an exercise in collecting facts. So in all of these cases, well, in Korea and Japan, and now I want to bring China into the equation, I wanted to return to this idea of teleology, or telos, that I brought up at the very beginning of the course, because now we can talk about the telos in all three of these cultures. And the fallacy of the teleology is that history inevitably leads up to the modern nation state, right? So that you're reading the present somehow into the past. And so even the very terms China, Japan, and Korea are more modern terms, although we can trace them back through this route to earlier roots. The idea that somehow in a history course, in a pre-modern history course, that we're always looking to how do we get to modern China, or how do we get to modern Korea, or how do we get to modern Japan, can cause distortion, particularly when nationalism enters the equation. So you might remember the example I said of the controversy over Goguryeo, whether it's a Korean kingdom or whether it was a Chinese, under Chinese influence and not Korean. When actually the answer is it was Goguryeo. It was neither Chinese nor Korean at the time. That's something that's going on only later. Having given you that caveat, we can identify 3 points in these 3 cultures where we can start talking about some sort of unified idea that I won't call a country. I guess the most neutral term might be state, perhaps. In the Chinese case, it's pretty obvious. It's the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BCE up there. The only time, the first time that one sort of ruler, in the case of the first Emperor Qin, claimed control over what was a large part of what we call the modern Chinese mainland. Before that was a set of competing kingdoms, or very small dynasties with a claim to very small areas. And that moment where you can talk about a sort of unified geographical area under one ruler comes later, but sort of simultaneously almost in the Korean and Japanese context around 7th century. In the Korean context with the unification of the 3 kingdoms under Shilla, and in the Japanese context with the Taika reforms and the establishment of this imperial model on the Japanese island. So these moments can be sort of thought of as the birth of the idea of a Korean state or a Japanese state back here, a Chinese state as well. But we don't want to tie our sort of modern interpretation, or modern ideas of Korea, Japan, and China too closely to these. But I think we can objectively take these as sort of turning points in the development of these 3 cultures. now that I've sort of brought us all up to speed, so we're all kind of the 7th century or so, or I guess in China we've already skipped ahead to the 9th century. So now we have China, Japan, and Korea kind of all in parallel. So I wanted to try and address them developing forward in relationship with one another. Buddhism, which was a question on your midterm, although not many of you actually did that essay once you did it, was a major sort of conduit by relationships between these three regions. Once they're all constituted as a sort of identifiable as Korea, Japan, and China, Buddhism becomes a major means of culture traveling between these three regions, and the Chinese written language becomes the major sort of carrier of Buddhism and culture generally. And I shouldn't leave aside Confucianism as well. But although Buddhism and Confucianism is coming out of China and traveling through Korea and into Japan as well, of course now we should return back to the Chinese case and see what's going on there. And so for next week, I want to look at Song Dynasty China and as well bring in Heian Japan and look at the issue of how power now constitutes itself in an East Asian world where you have all these sort of state actors in play. The readings I'll be posting on Blackboard for the rest of the course, including next week soon, so keep an eye out for that. I'll announce it. And then you're reading chapters 8 and 9. If you have questions about your essay or anything like that, we have about 15 minutes now, so you can come up and talk to me if you like. I don't have to leave it.